You know what really gets me about the Ford 427 SOHC? It's not the insane power output, though we'll definitely talk about that. It's not even the fact that NASCAR banned it before it could properly race, though that's absolutely criminal. No. What really gets me is that this engine, this absolute monster of American engineering, was essentially killed by politics and fear. Fear from Chrysler, fear from NASCAR, fear that Ford had actually built something so revolutionary, so game-changing, that it would have made everyone else look like they were racing go-karts. Never heard of the Camry? Oh boy, buckle up. What if I told you Ford built a 427 cubic inch overhead cam V8 that made over 600 horsepower in 1964? Yeah, you heard that. 600 from a naturally aspirated engine in 1964. While everyone else was still figuring out how to make their pushrod engines breathe properly, Ford went and built what was essentially a Formula One engine scaled up to American proportions. The story starts in 1963, and honestly, it begins with Chrysler being absolute bastards. See, Chrysler had just dropped their 426 Hemi on the racing world like a nuclear bomb. This thing was devastating everything in its path. Plymouth and Dodge were winning literally everything. Richard Petty took 37 wins in 1964 alone. 37! Ford was getting absolutely murdered out there, and something had to be done. Now here's where things get interesting. Ford could have just built a better pushrod engine. That would have been the sensible thing to do, the expected thing. But Ford looked at what Chrysler was doing with their hemispherical combustion chambers and thought, you know what? Screw it. Let's show them what real innovation looks like. They basically said, oh, you think your Hemi is advanced? Hold my beer. The development program was insane. Ford threw something like $2 million at this project, which in today's money is like $20 million. They pulled their best engineers off everything else. This was priority number one, beat Chrysler, period. And they gave themselves less than 90 days to design, prototype, and test a completely new engine architecture. 90 days. Most companies take longer than that to design a new coffee maker. What they came up with was nothing short of revolutionary. Single overhead cam per bank, chain-driven, with valves the size of dinner plates. The intake valves were 2.19 inches. The exhausts were 1.73. These are bigger than what you'd find in most modern performance engines. The valve train could spin to 7,000 RPM reliably, which for 1964 was absolutely astronomical. Most pushrod engines of the era would scatter themselves into a million pieces if you tried that. The combustion chambers were hemispherical, just like Chrysler's. But the overhead cam design meant Ford could optimize the valve angles in ways Chrysler couldn't dream of. The ports were massive, absolutely massive, with a straight shot into the combustion chamber. No weird turns, no compromises for pushrod placement, just pure uninterrupted flow. But wait, there's more. The timing chain setup was a work of art. We're talking about a 6-foot-long chain on each bank. 6 feet. Ford actually had to develop special tensioners and guides just to keep these chains under control. The whole system added about 50 pounds to the engine compared to a standard 427, but who cares about weight when you're making this kind of power? Initial dyno testing blew everyone's minds. The street version with a single 4-barrel carb made 550 horsepower. The race version with dual quads, 615. Some tuners claimed they could get 650 out of it. Remember, this is with 1960s technology. No fuel injection, no computer controls, just pure mechanical genius. Ford was so confident in this engine, they started shipping them to race teams before NASCAR had even approved it. That's how sure they were. They figured once NASCAR saw what this thing could do, approval would be a formality. Boy, were they wrong. Meanwhile, Chrysler got wind of what Ford was doing, and they absolutely lost their minds. Here they were, having just spent millions developing the Hemi, winning everything in sight. And Ford comes along with something that makes the Hemi look like yesterday's news. The overhead cam design was clearly superior from an engineering standpoint. Everyone knew it. Chrysler knew it, and Chrysler knew they couldn't respond quickly enough. So what did Chrysler do? They went crying to NASCAR. Literally. They threatened to pull out of NASCAR entirely if the Camry was approved. They argued it wasn't a production engine, that it was too exotic, too expensive, too far removed from what consumers could actually buy. Which was rich, considering you couldn't exactly walk into a Dodge dealer and buy a race-prepped Hemi either. NASCAR was in a tough spot. On one hand, they had Ford with this incredible piece of engineering that represented the future of motorsport. On the other hand, they had Chrysler threatening to take their ball and go home. And Chrysler had Richard Petty. Losing Petty would have been catastrophic for NASCAR's popularity. The politics got nasty, really nasty. There were closed-door meetings, threats, counter-threats. Ford pointed out that overhead cam engines were the future, that every European manufacturer was using them, that NASCAR was supposed to be about innovation and competition. Chrysler countered that NASCAR was about stock cars, and there was nothing stock about the Camry. Here's the thing, though. Ford actually did make the Camry available to the public, sort of. You could order one through Ford's Performance Parts catalog. It cost about $2,000, which was insane money in 1964. That's like $20,000 today just for an engine. But it was technically available, which should have satisfied NASCAR's production requirements. NASCAR's ruling came down in late 1964, and it was devastating for Ford. The Camry was banned from NASCAR competition, flat out banned. The official reason was that it wasn't a true production engine, but everyone knew the real reason. NASCAR was terrified of losing Chrysler and, by extension, losing Richard Petty and the massive fan base he brought. Ford was furious. Absolutely furious. They'd spent millions developing this engine specifically for NASCAR, and now they couldn't use it. There were rumors that Henry Ford II himself called Bill France and gave him an earful. Not that it mattered. The decision was final, but here's where Ford showed their genius. If they couldn't race it in NASCAR, they'd race it everywhere else. The Camry became the weapon of choice in drag racing. It dominated NHRA competition. Connie Kalitta, Don Nicholson, Gas Ronda, all the big names were running Camrys. The engine was so successful in drag racing that it became legendary, even though most people never knew it existed. The specifications were mind-blowing for the era. The engine weighed about 650 pounds fully dressed, which was only about 50 pounds more than a standard 427, but the power difference was astronomical. The Camry was making nearly 50% more power than a comparable pushrod engine. 50%, that's the difference between a Corvette and a Lamborghini. The technical details are fascinating. The cam lobes were specially designed with what Ford called a programmed profile. This meant the valves opened and closed at exactly the optimal rate for maximum flow and minimal stress. The valve springs were specially wound from exotic alloys. The rockers were needle bearing units that could handle sustained high RPM operation. Ford even developed special pistons for the Camry. These weren't your standard forged units. They had specially shaped domes to work with the hemispherical chambers, and the skirts were coated with a special anti-friction treatment. The connecting rods were shot-peened and magna-fluxed. Every single component was optimized for maximum performance. The oiling system was completely redesigned too. Ford knew that overhead cams needed serious oil flow, so they basically doubled the capacity of the oil pump. The pan held 8 quarts instead of the usual 5. There were special oil galleries drilled through the block to feed the cam towers. It was complex, but it worked beautifully. What really kills me is thinking about what could have been. Imagine if NASCAR had allowed the Camry to compete. We might have seen an arms race of overhead cam engines in the 60s. Chrysler would have been forced to develop their own SOHC design. GM would have jumped in. American automotive technology might have advanced by a decade, overnight. Instead, we got another 20 years of pushrod engines. Don't get me wrong, pushrods have their place. They're simple, reliable, and compact. But from a pure performance standpoint, overhead cams are superior. Always have been, always will be. The rest of the world figured this out in the 50s. America didn't catch on until the 80s. The Camry did find some success in other forms of racing. It powered funny cars to countless victories. It set records at Bonneville. There was even a marine version that powered offshore racing boats. But these were consolation prizes. The Camry was built for NASCAR, and NASCAR rejected it. Production numbers were pathetic. Ford built maybe 600 complete engines, though exact numbers are hard to pin down. Some sources say less than 500. Compare that to the thousands of Hemi Chrysler pumped out. It's heartbreaking. Each camera was essentially hand-built, assembled by Ford's best technicians in a special clean room environment. The few people who actually bought cameras for street use had interesting experiences. The engine was remarkably civilized when you weren't hammering on it. It would idle smoothly at 700 RPM, though it sounded like nothing else on the road. That distinctive whir of the timing chains was unmistakable, but cracked the throttle and all hell broke loose. The power delivery was instant and brutal. There are stories of guys putting cameras in galaxies and destroying everything at the drag strip. We're talking about street cars running 11-second quarter miles in 1965. That's supercar territory, even by today's standards. With slicks and some tuning, 10s were possible. In 1965, it's absolutely mind-boggling. The camera also had this interesting characteristic where it would actually get stronger as it got hotter. Most engines start to lose power as heat builds up, but the camera's overhead cam design dissipated heat so efficiently that it could maintain full power indefinitely. Drag racers loved this. You could hot lap the thing all day without losing a single horsepower. Ford tried to resurrect the camera several times. In 1967, they lobbied NASCAR again. Denied. In 1968, they proposed a de-stroked version that would meet displacement rules. Denied. By 1970, Ford had given up. The tooling was sold off or scrapped. The dream was dead. What's really tragic is that Ford was absolutely right about overhead cams being the future. Look at any modern performance engine. Mercedes-AMG, overhead cams. Ferrari, overhead cams. The new Corvette Z06, overhead cams. Even Ford's own Coyote V8 uses overhead cams. It just took American manufacturers 40 years to circle back to what Ford already knew in 1964. The few surviving cameras are now worth insane money. A complete original camera sells for over $100,000. Just the bare block can fetch 20 grand. There's a cottage industry of companies making reproduction parts because originals are so rare and valuable. It's become the holy grail of Ford performance engines. Some modern engine builders have taken original cameras and applied modern technology. We're talking about fuel injection, modern cam profiles, better materials. These updated cameras are making over 800 horsepower naturally aspirated. 800. That's modern supercar territory from a design that's nearly 60 years old. The influence of the camera extended far beyond its production run. Ford engineers who worked on the camera went on to design the Cleveland Series engines. The Boss 429 incorporated lessons learned from the camera. And guess what? They dominated immediately. Toyota's overhead cam engines won championship after championship. It's almost like Ford knew what they were talking about back in 1964. The story gets even more frustrating when you realize that Ford had plans for an evolved version. They were working on a dual overhead cam version, 4 cams, 32 valves. The prototype supposedly made over 700 horsepower, but with the SOHC version banned, there was no point developing it further. That engine exists only in Ford's archives, a tantalizing glimpse of what might have been. Meanwhile, Chrysler continued dominating NASCAR with the Hemi through the rest of the 60s. They won championships, set records, became legendary, all because they successfully lobbied to ban their strongest competition. It's brilliant strategy, I'll give them that. Evil, but brilliant. Here's something most people don't know. Ford actually considered taking NASCAR to court over the camera ban. They had lawyers draw up briefs arguing restraint of trade, anti-competitive practices. But Henry Ford II ultimately decided it wasn't worth the fight. He redirected Ford's racing efforts to Le Mans instead, which led to the GT40 program. So in a weird way, we can thank the camera ban for Ford beating Ferrari at Le Mans. The technical legacy of the camera lived on in unexpected ways. The timing chain setup Ford developed was adapted for industrial engines. The valve train geometry influenced a generation of Ford engineers. The metallurgy advances made for the camera's components found their way into aerospace applications. This engine pushed boundaries in ways that went far beyond racing. There's a parallel universe where the camera was approved for NASCAR. In that universe, American cars probably got fuel injection and overhead cams in the 70s instead of the 90s. We probably never had the malaise era of the late 70s and early 80s. Gas crisis? What? Gas crisis? When your engines are 30% more efficient thanks to better valve train technology, fuel economy is less of an issue. But that's not the universe we live in. In our universe, the camera is a footnote, a what if, a reminder that sometimes the best technology doesn't win. Sometimes politics wins, sometimes fear wins, sometimes the status quo is just too entrenched to overcome, no matter how superior your solution is. The real tragedy is that Ford never got to prove the camera in competition, not really. Sure, it dominated drag racing, but that's not what it was built for. It was built to go door to door with the Hemi at Daytona, to battle through 500 miles at Charlotte, to prove that American engineering could match anything from Europe. And it never got that chance. Today, original cameras are treated like religious artifacts. The guys who own them baby them, rebuild them with obsessive attention to detail, display them at shows like sculptures, which they are really. That valve cover with 427 SOHC cast into it is automotive art. The engine itself with those massive timing covers and that distinctive profile looks like nothing else Ford ever built. There's been talk over the years of Ford building a modern Camry, taking the architecture and updating it with direct injection, variable valve timing, modern materials. Can you imagine? 1,000 horsepower naturally aspirated from 427 cubic inches is probably achievable with modern technology, but Ford seems content to let the legend rest. What frustrates me most is that the Camry represented a fork in the road for American automotive development. We could have gone the overhead cam route in the 60s. We could have been competing with European technology on equal terms. Instead, we stuck with push rods for another generation while the rest of the world moved forward. The muscle car era might have evolved into something even more incredible if overhead cams had been embraced. The Camry owners I've talked to all say the same thing. It's not just an engine, it's a statement. A statement that Ford could build anything, beat anything, if given the chance. The fact that it was banned just adds to the mystique. It's the engine that was too good, too advanced, too threatening to the establishment. Perhaps the ultimate irony is that Chrysler, the company that got the Camry banned, eventually abandoned the Hemi for overhead cam designs in their modern engines. Even they couldn't ignore the superiority of overhead cams forever. It just took them 40 years to admit Ford was right. So next time someone tells you American manufacturers couldn't build sophisticated engines in the 60s, tell them about the Camry. Tell them about the engine that made 600 horsepower when most cars made 200. Tell them about the overhead cam V8 that was so good it had to be banned. Tell them about Ford's greatest engine that never was. The 427 SOHC Camry remains one of the biggest what-ifs in automotive history. What if NASCAR had approved it? What if Ford had been able to race it? What if overhead cams had become the standard for American performance engines in 1965 instead of 2005? We'll never know. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that the Camry failed, but that it never got the chance to succeed. Sometimes I wonder if there's still a Camry sitting in some Ford warehouse, forgotten under tarp, waiting to be discovered. Probably not, but a part of me hopes there is, because this engine deserves better than being a footnote in history. It deserves recognition as one of the most advanced, most powerful, most revolutionary engines America ever produced. The Ford 427 SOHC Camry, the engine that was too good for its own good.